Victim on the scene. We've got one victim pronounced at the hospital, and she was 6 to 8 weeks pregnant. So we have a triple homicide.
Hair is your crown. And the one thing you can control is your crown.
She was going to get her money back.
In this second episode of a two-part special, we wrap up a complex mystery.
Who's our shooter? Who's our driver? Are we 100% sure we got this right?
Featuring unexpected suspects.
She looked like a schoolgirl. I mean, she was very young.
2 other witnesses described seeing a man on the scene.
And a trial filled with surprises.
We didn't know which way it was going to go.
I want justice for my child.
In January 2016, Memphis, Tennessee police are investigating a shooting in an apartment parking lot, which first claimed the life of 30-year-old Eddie Tate Jr., then his girlfriend, 33-year-old Edwina Thomas, and their unborn baby.
Meaning that law enforcement, they're no longer dealing with a homicide or a double homicide. Now they're dealing with a triple homicide.
The victims' loved ones are desperate for answers.
You get on social media, like everybody's making up stories, everybody's creating their own narrative.
The shooting happened when Eddie was supposed to be meeting a customer for his mobile hair business, Virgin Hair for Us.
This case revolved around the sale or a transaction involving hair or hair weave. And some people may look at it as if, well, this is trivial, this is minor, but not necessarily for the black community. Hair is your crown. And the one thing you can control is your crown. So this is a cultural thing among many black Americans. The hair business among the black community is an $8 billion business every year.
In the hours after the shooting, detectives trace a vehicle seen fleeing the crime scene to 18-year-old high school student Victoria C. They question her at the station.
When Victoria is interviewed, she names Shelby Isaac.
She says that Shelby, her high school classmate, bought 3 bundles of hair from Eddie earlier that day, but was unhappy with her purchase and wanted a refund.
We asked her, was she discussing robbing him, since she said she wanted her money back? And the initial statement was no. She never straight out said that it was going to be a robbery, but that she was going to get her money back.
Victoria tells police she drove Shelby to meet Eddie at Sycamore Lake Apartments for the second time that day.
As they approach the parking lot, Victoria drops off her friend Shelby to go handle the transaction while she goes and finds a parking spot.
Victoria claims she heard gunshots and then saw Shelby holding a gun.
And she hops in the vehicle, drives off without her friend.
So Victoria says she does not know where Shelby went. She pulls out of the complex and she's calling her on the phone. They meet up several minutes later. They talk. According to Victoria, Shelby says that she shot the hairman, and the lady said that she was pregnant.
Victoria claims that after the incident, she and Shelby hung out with their friend Darian Melvin. Then they dropped Shelby off with another friend, Gary Dotson. When Victoria finishes her story, investigators aren't sure what to believe.
We didn't know if she was lying. We didn't know if she was trying to blame someone else. So we had to verify that the information that she was telling us was in fact correct.
There is one detail from Victoria's story that makes them think she might be telling at least part of the truth.
There's no way that either Shelby or Victoria could have known that Edwina Thomas was pregnant. She was only 6 or 7 weeks pregnant. I just don't think that they would have been able to get that information any other way. That was very important to the investigation.
Victoria is arrested and charged with accessory after the fact.
She received a $10,000 bond and was out of jail after making that statement.
Investigators take a closer look at 18-year-old Shelby Isaac. Like Victoria, Shelby appears to be an unlikely murder suspect.
She was a high school student who did very well. She was a smart girl. She had applied to colleges and had been accepted to 3 different colleges. She was looking forward to going to college and finishing her degree and moving on to a career.
People will say, how can an honor student commit such a heinous act? But people live double lives all the time. While she's in school, there's supervision. When she's not in school, she can be a completely different person because there's a lack of structure.
Determined to get to the truth, investigators seek Shelby out for questioning.
We went to family members' houses. We went to her residence. Anything that she had ever listed as an associate, we went to all these different places, but we didn't have any luck finding her.
Investigators are able to locate 18-year-old Darian Melvin, the young man Victoria told them she and Shelby hung out with following the shooting. Darian confirms he went for a ride with Shelby and Victoria, and both of them seemed on edge.
He said the car was very tense, but they all normally joked around, so he was joking around. And I think he actually made a joke about Shelby's hair, to which she responded some version of like, shut up or I'm gonna shoot you.
Darian also confirms that they dropped Shelby at the apartment of another friend, Gary Dotson.
Gary Dotson was Victoria C.'s boyfriend. His brother, I believe, was Shelby's boyfriend.
But when investigators attempt to locate Gary, turns out he's laying low.
Gary Dotson, there were multiple attempts to find him, and sometimes, witnesses just don't want to be found.
2 days after the shooting, Shelby Isaac's attorney brings Shelby into the station.
And her attorney states, they're not going to give a statement at this time.
That is not any indication of guilt. Something that you said could be twisted to make it look as though you were guilty. That is admissible in court. So there is no benefit that you can receive from speaking to a detective in a situation like this.
That's certainly people's right. They don't have to talk with us. That just makes the job that I have to do even more important.
Before Shelby leaves, she makes an unusual move for someone facing multiple homicide charges.
She was caught actually taking a selfie inside that particular interview room. We were not happy. We were not happy with that. I really thought she wasn't really worried about this, didn't think it was a big deal.
While investigators still believe that Shelby was involved in some way, they face the fact that for now, the teen will walk free.
There was not an arrest made for Shelby Isaac. We had to verify that the information Victoria is telling us was correct. We had to corroborate that at a minimum, they were either together, another witness saw Shelby on the scene. We had to put them together some kind of way. And at the very beginning, we were not able to do that.
She's not going to give a statement, and that's when they released her without charge.
Was I happy about her walking out that door? Absolutely not.
They still hadn't determined, again, who's our shooter, who's our driver. Are we 100% sure we got this right before we put murder charges on people?
Days after the homicides of Eddie Tate Jr., Edwina Thomas, and their unborn child, investigators have released suspect Shelby Isaac due to a lack of evidence. Her alleged getaway driver, Victoria C., remains out on bail. Determined to get to the truth, investigators keep tabs on Shelby by watching her social media accounts.
She was very active on social media, very active on Facebook, Snapchat, different things like that. It seemed a little strange to us of some of the quotes that she made right after she's been accused of committing a triple homicide. There was a lot of posts that she did that just kind of led us to believe that she thought that this is just an inconvenience for her and then she's going to go back to living her life.
Investigators subpoena Eddie Tate's phone records from the date of the shooting.
We noticed that there were 8 calls that day from a number, and that number was the last number to call him before, unfortunately, he lost his life. We had an investigator take this number and run it, so to speak, and see what we could find to connect it.
The phone number leads investigators to a familiar name, Shelby Isaac.
They were able to tie it back to a number that we knew that she used. I went back to her family member's account, but it was a number that was commonly associated with Shelby and being Shelby's phone number.
The records place Shelby in contact with Eddie, but do not prove she is a killer.
This was not the first time that Shelby had purchased hair from Mr. Tate. This was not the first time that she had spoken to or met with him.
Detectives continue their hunt for evidence. They obtain security footage from a resident at the apartment complex where the shooting took place.
We did not have any video of the actual shooting. A witness came forward who, ironically, was in his apartment complex setting up a security system. It's audio and videoed. It's time-stamped.
Although you can't see, because it's the interior of his apartment, you can't see out and see the murder. What you can do is hear the gunshots. This is loud, it's gruesome, it's mean, and it's evil.
The recording allows detectives to make an important connection. The last of the 8 calls that Shelby made to Eddie came just moments before the shots rang out.
The timestamp is, exactly the time. So we were able to verify and use that timestamp information to match up with the phone records.
Together, the recording and the phone records further prove Shelby was in contact with Eddie just moments before he lost his life. But it still doesn't prove who pulled the trigger. In the hopes to gather more evidence, authorities processed Victoria C.'s silver Mitsubishi.
I did a search warrant on that vehicle. There was a sweatshirt that was found. That sweatshirt was examined at that time, and it showed to have a red substance on it, which tested positive for human blood. There was a DNA swab taken of that shirt, and then the shirt itself was tagged in the property room, and it was later sent to the TBI lab for DNA testing.
On February 2nd, investigators re-interview Victoria C.
The police called her back, confronted her with some of the evidence that we had, and she gave a second statement to police.
This time, Victoria adds a significant new detail to her story.
She said that when Shelby got in the vehicle, when she picked her up in front of the apartment complex, she had blood on her hands. During the first interview with Victoria, she never mentioned Shelby Isaac having any type of blood on her hands when she got in the vehicle. She said that when Shelby got in the vehicle and reached to either move her purse or retrieve her purse, and possibly got on the shirt that way.
Investigators now feel they have enough evidence to arrest Shelby Isaac.
We were ultimately able to, put the pieces together, and there was an arrest warrant issued.
On February the 5th, Shelby came and turned herself in, but said, "I don't have any information for you." My advice in almost every case is for my clients not to give a statement.
Shelby is charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder. Detectives share the news with the victims' families.
They just told us she was a young lady who was disgruntled about a purchase she made, and she wanted her money back.
I was angry. I was pissed. How could somebody, like, you're in high school. Like what are you doing? Over some hair?
Memphis police have charged 18-year-old Shelby Isaac with murdering Eddie Tate Jr., Edwina Thomas, and their unborn child.
Once Shelby Isaac became the focus of police investigations, her family hired 2 expensive, high-profile attorneys.
Facing 3 charges of first-degree murder, Shelby is held without bond.
What we did is we began preparing for the preliminary hearing. At this point, we knew that Victoria C. was the primary source of evidence against Shelby.
Detectives know Shelby's attorneys will attempt to discredit Victoria's statement. A part of that statement is that Victoria claimed Shelby had blood on her hands when she got in the car.
One thing that corroborated what Victoria told us was what was found in her car was a jacket that had blood on it.
Investigators learned that the DNA results from the bloody sweatshirt are back.
The sweatshirt DNA was a mixture of at least 2 people, and the major portion of the mixture, which is the person that was contributing more DNA to that mixture, matched Eddie Tate.
What that tells us is whoever you think did it, they were in the car with Eddie's blood on them in Victoria's car shortly after this happened.
But there's a problem with the second minor portion of the mixture on the shirt.
For the minor contributor profile of the DNA mixture that I obtained, there was not enough DNA information there for me to do any kind of comparison. The minor DNA profile was inconclusive. I was not able to do a comparison to Victoria Say or Shelby Isaac.
That does not mean that they are completely innocent. It just simply means that you can't tie them to the crime using DNA.
Still in need of more evidence placing Shelby at the scene, investigators combed through the case file.
I went back over my witness statements. I went back over my crime scene photos. The witnesses on the scene, they see someone in multicolored leggings go inside the victim's vehicle. When Edwina Thomas, when her clothing is recovered from the hospital, she has gray pants. When Victoria is arrested, she has black pants on, and the witnesses described her having black pants.
Authorities believe Shelby was the woman in the multicolored leggings.
So I'm theorizing that Shelby went inside the vehicle after the shooting. I go back to Eddie Tate's vehicle. There's papers on the front passenger seat. These papers are still there from when the car was processed. It's in a secured lot. It's our impound lot.
There was stuff in the floorboard of the car, and also the glove compartment was open.
I retrieved those papers. There's several bank receipts. There's a couple of envelopes and a couple of, debit cards.
The detective, being a good detective, he gathered up everything and said, let's check this.
They send the items to the Memphis Police Department's latent fingerprint examiner.
We have this system now that we call AFIS. And what it is, it's an automated fingerprint identification system, and it electronically encodes and records and retains fingerprints.
The examiner compares the fingerprint on the bank receipt found in Eddie's car to those of Shelby Isaac.
I saw that Miss Isaac had loop patterns in her hands, so I just began to compare the loops on her hand to the loops on the receipt until I found the correct finger, which was her number 3 finger or the middle finger, to make the positive identification. The importance is that it simply put Miss Isaac at the scene. There was no denying that she was at the scene.
If Shelby was the woman in the leggings seen rummaging through Eddie's vehicle, that could help prosecutors prove a potential motive.
Police think after the shooting, she's rummaging for money to get back what she thought was rightfully hers.
I believe that Shelby was very angry that Eddie wasn't budging. He was not going to give her money back. He was not going to refund her $250. He was not going to do that.
Maybe for Shelby, this was her retribution. This was payback.
On March 8, 2016, nearly 6 weeks after the shooting, the families of Eddie Tate Jr. and Edwina Thomas attend an arraignment hearing for Shelby Isaac, hoping to witness justice firsthand.
Her attorneys asked for the evidence to be presented to a judge instead of a grand jury.
But the hearing takes a shocking turn.
At the end of the preliminary hearing, the judge determined that the state had not met the burden of proof, which is a very low burden of proof in general sessions. And the judge at that point dismissed the case entirely.
The judge didn't want to try this case. The judge said there was not enough evidence to try it. So at that moment in time, Shelby was able to walk free.
I fell to my knees and I said, no, that's not it. No, she's not killing my baby and get away with murder. I want justice for my child.
On March 8, 2016, a judge dismisses the case against Shelby Isaac. The 18-year-old suspected of fatally shooting Eddie Tate Jr., Edwina Thomas, and their unborn child. Shelby could be released in a matter of hours.
It kind of deflated me because it was like, yeah, you made the arrest, thank you. But now, this is the hard part of us, just kind of accepting what happened, going through the court process, and then to put your trust in the justice system, and then you feel like it failed because it was thrown out.
You all told me that this girl would look at 50 years to life, and now she walking free? She killed my child like he was a dog and left him laying in the street?
The family didn't want to let it go. The state didn't want to let it go. They truly believed they had the right person.
But the arraignment judge declining to send the case to trial does not mean it's over.
That does not bar the prosecution from still seeking an indictment. And actually, the prosecutor immediately took Shelby's case up to a grand jury.
I knew that the grand jury was going to convene that afternoon, and so I prepared an indictment. Grand jury looked at it and found there was a true bill. An indictment merely means that there's enough evidence to go to trial.
Well, I got a phone call. It was telling me Miss Tate is taken care of.
The news is a complete turnaround for Shelby Isaac and her family.
Her parents, her mother, her siblings was there at the entrance waiting on her to come out. And the officer put the handcuff back on her and said she failed. She fell to her knees and said she started crying.
Obviously, there was a roller coaster ride. It was dismissed. And then to turn around and have that indictment come down the same day, which normally the indictment process in Shelby County takes months. And for that to happen so quickly, it was jarring.
The defendant was not released, so she stayed in jail from that day on.
For the next year, both sides prepare for a complicated trial.
For you to have a crime and charges to stick, you need to have what we call mens rea and actus rea. That means we need a guilty mind and a guilty act. So with this first-degree murder, you have to prove that it was premeditated.
We have no witnesses, no smoking gun, who saw the shots being fired. We had a defendant who's really left no traces except for her fingerprints on a receipt.
I can't stress enough how circumstantial this case was, but collectively, it was always our theory that when you look at it together, it's very clear what happened.
In November 2017, the trial begins. There is one name conspicuously missing from the witness list: Shelby Isaac.
She did not testify. She looked like a schoolgirl. I mean, she was very young, but she had glasses on. She had like a little polo sweater. And I mean, you look and you think, wow, this person charged with murder?
The only message from Shelby comes in the form of her plea, not guilty.
The atmosphere in the courtroom was very tense from both sides. You feel the weight of it, and that's what adds to, honestly, the gravity of the situation and the importance of the situation. But both sides had a ton of support, and it was stay in a room only for a while.
Prosecutors hit the ground running, calling a surprise witness to the stand, Gary Dotson. Located just 2 days before the trial, Gary testifies that Victoria dropped Shelby off at his house on the afternoon of January 22nd, 2016, just hours after the shootings.
Shelby and Victoria show up where Gary's staying. Victoria leaves in the silver Mitsubishi. Shelby stays there.
Mr. Dotson testified that when she came in, she looked tired. That was his word. And that she had a wad of money just balled up.
Prosecutors suggest that the money could have been proceeds from Eddie's sales that day, money Shelby stole from him after the shooting.
The state's theory was she just wanted her money back. We thought that she set up this second meeting to take care and to get whatever money Eddie had.
According to Gary, Shelby wanted to take a nap.
She went to the restroom, then went to his bedroom where she laid down what he described as a 9mm Ruger pistol.
What Gary says next delivers a serious blow to Shelby's defense.
He went through the magazine with the ammunition and saw that rounds had been fired.
He said that he noticed that the magazine was not full, that it only had 3 or 4 rounds in it. So it had been shot a few times at least.
Even so, Gary Dotson kept his observations to himself until now.
He didn't say anything to Shelby. He did not call authorities. Street code.
Neither Gary nor prosecutors know what happened to the gun.
It could be anywhere. It could be in the Mississippi River, it could be in a dumpster somewhere, but it was never located.
Shelby's team of high-powered defense attorneys take aim at Gary, leveling an accusation that no one sees coming.
The defense tried to imply that Gary Dotson was somehow involved in this situation.
The biggest thing that I kept on coming back to was all of the witnesses that were in this apartment complex. Windows around this center parking lot area that looked out as soon as they heard shots. 2 other witnesses described seeing a man on the scene.
In November 2017, the murder trial of Shelby Isaac is underway in Memphis, Tennessee. Prosecutors have called Shelby's friend, Gary Dotson, to the stand.
Gary told me everything that he saw. He witnessed Shelby with the gun. He witnessed her with a wad of cash.
Having carefully combed through the multiple witness statements from the day of the murder, Shelby's defense hones in on a previously ignored detail.
2 other witnesses described a man there with Victoria. That was the one thing that I kept on coming back to.
If a man was there, could it have been Gary? The defense argues another important detail.
Gary had several things in this case that could have implicated him. There was a black sweatshirt that Victoria identified as being Gary Dotson's sweatshirt that was covered in Eddie Tate's blood.
Prosecutors counter by arguing no one can prove the bloody sweatshirt was Gary's. They also call a forensic expert who suggests a connection between the 9mm Gary saw in Shelby's possession and the 6 shell casings collected from the crime scene.
A ballistics expert examined and testified that the bullets and the evidence all point to that these rounds came from a Ruger handgun, the very same type of weapon that Gary Dotson said that he saw on the loan to Shelby Isaacs.
But that gun was never found, never tested, most certainly never located in Shelby's belongings.
Darian Melvin, the friend that was with Victoria and Shelby on the afternoon of the murder, also takes the stand. In addition to experts who testify about Shelby's fingerprints and phone records, the prosecution's case ultimately hinges on the testimony of one young woman, Shelby's friend, Victoria C.
When Victoria testified, she pretty much told the jury and everyone that she took Shelby back over to meet with EJ because Shelby was upset about her hair purchase and she wanted her money back. Victoria testified, I think she said she dropped her off and Shelby started to walk. So she then went to park the car, and by the time she got out of the car to go to where they were meeting at, she heard gunshots.
Defense attorneys circle back once more to eyewitness accounts, careful to point out that Victoria is the only person who positively identifies Shelby as being at the scene of the murder.
All of the lay witnesses described seeing Victoria. They described her, what she was wearing, and then they described Edwina Thomas getting out of the car.
According to Shelby's defense, the woman witnesses described as wearing colorful leggings could have been anyone.
Victoria C. was out there. Edwina Thomas was out there. Shelby Isaac was never identified by any of those lay witnesses. How do they think that they can prove that she did this or that she was out there? Because no one, aside from Victoria C., put her there.
Shelby's attorneys continue to attempt to discredit the prosecution's evidence, one piece at a time.
None of the evidence pointed to Shelby. There was never any forensic DNA evidence. There was a fingerprint belonging to Shelby that was located on a receipt inside of Eddie Tate's car. But Victoria described at the initial meeting when Shelby actually did meet Eddie Tate at that McDonald's to purchase the hair, Victoria C. described Shelby sit down inside on the passenger side of Eddie Tate's vehicle, actually getting into the car with him, which is precisely where that piece of evidence was found. There was nothing about that fingerprint on that receipt that implicated Shelby in this shooting at all.
On November 17th, both sides make their closing arguments.
The investigator had said, follow the evidence. And I brought that back up in closing argument because if you follow the evidence, it does not lead you to Shelby. It leads you to Victoria C. It might lead you to Gary Dotson, but it does not lead you to Shelby.
On rebuttal, the prosecution disagrees.
Victoria didn't buy hair from Eddie. Shelby did. Gary Dotson didn't think he got bad hair. Shelby did. Nobody else had given their money to Eddie. Nobody else wanted their money back. It was Shelby's. She made the decision to pull that trigger multiple times. That's why we were here.
As closing arguments wrap up, neither side rests easy.
It was a very contentious trial, and a lot of people didn't think that we would get a conviction on it.
She took a life, and I said, I know it's not gonna bring my baby back, but I think she should give a life. I felt like out of all the hurt and pain I had suffered, I deserve a peace of mind to know that you are somewhere locked up and you won't hurt anybody else's child.
After 3 hours of deliberation, the jury returns their verdict in the murder trial of Shelby Isaac.
Of course, everybody's terrified, nervous, scared, anxious.
It was almost suffocating, like the air in the room. But you sit there, you stand up for the jury to come in, then the judge says, everybody be seated. And they ask, have you reached a verdict? The foreman says yes.
Ms. Isaac, please stand.
The trial jury in this case found her guilty of second-degree murder, which is a knowing killing of Eddie Tate. They found her guilty of reckless homicide in the count 3, which was related to Edwina Thomas. In the final count with the unborn baby, they found her guilty of criminally negligent homicide.
When they said guilty, it was like a sense of relief because we didn't know which way it was going to go.
The news hit Shelby hard.
When the word guilty came out of the foreperson's mouth, even before the charge had been read of what they found her guilty of, Shelby started collapsing.
Ms. Murphy, is that your verdict? Mr. Aldridge, is that your verdict? Ms. Foster, is that your verdict?
Yes.
And is that your verdict, ma'am? Is that your verdict, ma'am? Sir, is that your verdict? Ma'am, is that your verdict?
It was a hard moment for me, not just as an attorney, but as a person seeing this happen. When you have this girl literally passed out on the floor, and all around the rest of the courtroom was business as usual. The judge didn't even stop polling the jury.
Her family was overcome with emotion. They started screaming and crying, and I've always thought the reality of just how serious this was and the consequences that she now faces finally set in with the reading of the verdict.
As to count 2 of the indictment, we, the jury, find the defendant guilty of second-degree murder.
I'm sure she was overwhelmed. Your life is now impacted. You took lives, now you have to give a bit of yours.
The judge said, your son was 30 years old. So guess what, Miss Tate? We're going to take 30 years of her life, then we're going to give her 30 years. 30 years without parole.
I feel like 3 lives are worth more than 30 years. She took away a mom, a daughter, a sister, a best friend. Like, she took all of that away from us.
As time has gone on and I've grown, I feel sorry for her. I feel sorry for her because she made a decision that impacted so many people, including herself.
This was a very sad case where a man, a woman, and their unborn child lost their lives. And that is tragic. There is nothing that can make that tragedy any less. But I truly, truly hope that Shelby gets another day in court because the evidence was not there. I mean, I just care about her as a person. And I really tried to give her absolutely everything that I could.
Victoria C. avoids trial with a plea deal.
She was an aider and abetter. She was offered accessory after the fact, 3 counts of it. And that she pled guilty to that.
She is sentenced to 6 years probation. For the victims' families, no amount of justice can replace the loss of their loved ones.
Edwina was just a kind person. She didn't deserve what happened to her. She was loved. She was so loved by many people. And her life was just taken away too soon.
We got justice, but yet and still didn't bring my baby back. To bury your child and look down on your child being put in the ground is more than a mother can bear.
I miss her. I miss him. Like, me and EJ were close in the time that they were together. I miss him. I wanted to know if I was gonna have another niece or nephew. So it hurts, but we take it one day at a time.
Reality of it is, you learn to live. You learn to live, but you don't forget. You never forget.
On the morning of June 8, 1989, a quiet neighborhood in Richmond, British Columbia, became the setting for one of Canada's most enduring mysteries. A passerby noticed something unusual in the overgrown grass near an abandoned property. Hidden from the road, partially concealed by tall weeds, lay the body of a woman who had spent the previous 7 years telling anyone who would listen that someone was trying to kill her. That woman was Cindy James. By the time investigators arrived, there was little doubt that the scene would raise more questions than answers. Cindy's hands and feet were bound behind her back. A nylon stocking was wrapped tightly around her neck. Toxicology would later reveal lethal levels of morphine, along with other drugs in her system. Yet despite an extensive investigation, no one could explain exactly how she died, who, if anyone, had been responsible, or whether the terrifying campaign she described for years had been the work of a relentless stalker or something far more complicated. Most homicide investigations begin with a body and a search for a killer. Cindy James's case was different. The investigation had in many ways begun years before her death. Long before her body was discovered, police files had already grown thick with reports bearing her name. Hundreds of threatening phone calls. Anonymous letters promising that she would die. Windows smashed in the middle of the night. Fires. Dead pets. Strange figures allegedly watching her home. Violent assaults that left her bruised, unconscious, and terrified. Nearly 100 separate incidents were reported to police over 7 years. Each new attack seemed to reinforce the last. Each report suggested that someone was patiently dismantling her life, one frightening episode at a time. Yet every investigation seemed to end at the same place. No suspect. No witnesses who could identify an attacker. No fingerprints leading to an arrest. No physical evidence that clearly established who was behind the campaign. As months turned into years, the mystery deepened instead of becoming clearer. Detectives, psychologists, journalists, and private investigators all examined the case from different angles. Some became convinced that Cindy was the victim of an extraordinarily determined stalker. Others believed that at least some of the incidents had been self-inflicted or staged, pointing to the absence of verifiable evidence despite years of police involvement. The more people looked at the evidence, the more divided they became. It was a case that challenged assumptions about victims, offenders, mental health, and the limits of criminal investigations. For the police, every new report presented the same impossible question. Were they searching for an invisible criminal who somehow managed to avoid leaving meaningful evidence? Or were they chasing a story that could never lead to an arrest because the threat existed in a far more complicated form? For Cindy herself, however, the debate that would later dominate documentaries and books did not exist. Friends described a woman who appeared frightened, exhausted, and increasingly isolated. Whether every reported incident could be explained or not, there is little dispute that she lived for years under the weight of overwhelming fear. The uncertainty surrounding her life did not end with her death. Instead, it became even greater. The official investigation consumed enormous resources. Detectives reconstructed timelines, interviewed friends, neighbors, co-workers, medical professionals, and family members. They examined financial records, analyzed forensic evidence, reviewed years of police reports, and attempted to reconcile every known event with the physical evidence found at the scene. The effort produced thousands of pages of documentation. It did not produce a definitive answer. When the case eventually reached a coroner's inquest, even after years of investigation, the central question remained unresolved. The evidence could not conclusively prove that Cindy James had been murdered. At the same time, investigators could not confidently conclude that she had taken her own life or accidentally caused the circumstances leading to her death. The final conclusion reflected that uncertainty. The cause of death was classified as an unknown event. Few official findings are more unsettling. It was neither homicide nor suicide. Neither solved nor unsolved in the traditional sense. It occupied a rare space where the available evidence refused to support a single coherent explanation. More than 3 decades later, the case continues to provoke debate among investigators, forensic experts, psychologists, and followers of true crime. Every major theory appears persuasive at first glance. Every theory also encounters evidence that complicates it. If an unknown stalker existed, how did that person evade detection for so many years despite repeated police involvement? If the incidents were self-generated, how can certain physical findings and witness accounts be fully explained? If the truth lies somewhere between those possibilities, what pieces of the story are still missing? Those questions remain unanswered. Unlike many famous criminal investigations, there is no dramatic courtroom confession waiting at the end of Cindy James's story. There is no DNA breakthrough that neatly identifies a killer. There is no hidden recording revealing the truth after decades of speculation. Instead, there is a life interrupted by fear, an investigation defined by uncertainty, and a death that continues to resist simple explanations. This is not merely the story of an unsolved death. It is the story of how uncertainty itself became the central mystery. Over the course of the next chapters, we will examine the known facts, separate verified evidence from speculation, explore the competing theories, and follow the investigation step by step. Rather than seeking sensational answers, we will focus on what can be established, what remains disputed, and why the case of Cindy James continues to be regarded as one of the most perplexing mysteries in Canadian criminal history. To understand the mystery surrounding Cindy James, it is important to begin not with the questions that followed her death, but with the world she lived in before fear became part of her daily routine. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, Richmond, British Columbia, was widely regarded as a quiet suburban community on the outskirts of Vancouver. Residential neighborhoods were expanding, families were settling into newly built homes, and the city carried a reputation for being a safe place to live and work. Violent crime certainly existed, as it does in any growing community, but few residents imagined that one of Canada's most debated criminal cases would emerge from these peaceful streets. It was in this setting that Cindy James built what appeared to be an ordinary life. Born in 1944, Cindy chose a profession centered on caring for others. She worked as a registered nurse, a career that required long hours, emotional resilience, and compassion for people during some of the most difficult moments of their lives. Friends and colleagues generally described her as dedicated to her patients and committed to her work. Nursing was more than employment. It was a significant part of her identity. Outside the hospital, Cindy's life appeared equally conventional. She married physician Roy Makepeace, and together they established a home in Richmond. From the outside, there seemed to be the life many people hoped to achieve: stable careers, financial security, and a comfortable suburban lifestyle. Like many marriages, however, theirs faced challenges that remained largely private. By 1982, the relationship had deteriorated, and the couple separated. Divorce and separation are emotionally difficult under any circumstances, often bringing uncertainty about the future, financial adjustments, and profound personal loss. For Cindy, the end of the marriage marked the beginning of an entirely different chapter, one that would soon become the focus of police files, media coverage, and decades of public speculation. Within months of the separation, unusual events began to occur. The first incident seemed almost ordinary when viewed individually. Anonymous telephone calls interrupted the silence of the evening. The caller rarely identified themselves. Sometimes there was only breathing on the line. On other occasions, threatening words were spoken before the call abruptly ended. Anonymous letters soon followed, carrying messages that suggested someone wanted Cindy to live in constant fear. At first, such incidents could easily be dismissed as harassment. Unwanted calls and anonymous letters, while disturbing, do not necessarily point to a violent offender. Friends encouraged Cindy to ignore them. Police documented the complaints but had little evidence to pursue. Then the incidents escalated. According to police records and later investigations, Cindy reported broken windows, acts of vandalism, threatening messages, suspicious individuals near her home, and other events that appeared increasingly personal. Each new report seemed connected to the last, creating the impression of a campaign directed specifically at her. The pattern distinguished her case from random acts of mischief. Whoever was responsible, if there was a single individual, appeared familiar with her routines. That perception gradually altered the way Cindy lived. Simple daily activities took on new meaning. Returning home after work no longer brought comfort. An unexpected sound outside the house demanded attention. A ringing telephone could trigger anxiety rather than curiosity. The familiar surroundings of her neighborhood no longer felt entirely safe. As the reports continued, Cindy sought help through multiple channels. She contacted the police repeatedly, documenting each new incident. She also retained the services of private investigator Ozzie Cabin, hoping that independent surveillance might identify the person she believed was targeting her. Security measures around her home increased, reflecting her growing concern that the threats might eventually become physical violence. The investigations, however, produced an unsettling pattern. Evidence existed that incidents had occurred. A damaged window, threatening correspondence, signs of vandalism, but clear evidence identifying the perpetrator remained elusive. Detectives interviewed neighbors, examined physical evidence where available, and attempted to establish motives or suspects. Despite these efforts, no individual could be conclusively linked to the harassment. This absence of answers became one of the defining features of the case. Over time, investigators found themselves confronting two separate questions. The first was straightforward. Who, if anyone, was responsible for the reported attacks? The second proved far more complicated. Were all of the reported incidents connected, or were they the result of different causes? The distinction mattered enormously. If a single offender existed, investigators were dealing with a persistent and unusually cautious stalker who repeatedly avoided detection. If not, then the overall picture might be far more complex than anyone initially believed. As months turned into years, the uncertainty affected nearly everyone involved. Family members struggled to understand what Cindy was experiencing. Friends offered support while trying to reconcile the frightening stories with the lack of identifiable suspects. Police officers devoted substantial time and resources to investigating each new report, yet found themselves returning repeatedly to the same conclusion. There was insufficient evidence to identify a perpetrator. The growing file of reports did not simplify the investigation. It complicated it. By the mid-1980s, Cindy's case had become known among investigators as one unlike any they had previously encountered. Each new incident demanded attention because the possibility of genuine danger could not be dismissed. At the same time, repeated investigations failed to produce the kind of physical evidence typically expected in cases involving long-term stalking. This unusual combination gradually influenced public perception. Some observers accepted Cindy's account without hesitation, believing she was the victim of an extraordinarily determined individual who had learned how to avoid leaving evidence. Others questioned whether every reported incident had occurred exactly as described, pointing to the absence of arrests despite years of investigation. These competing interpretations would eventually shape public discussion of the case, but during the early years the primary concern remained Cindy's safety. Whether viewed as the target of an unidentified stalker, or as someone experiencing an exceptionally complex personal crisis, she was living under conditions of persistent fear. Looking back today, it is tempting to search those early years for obvious warning signs or decisive turning points. Yet the historical record offers no single moment when investigators could clearly identify the path the case would take. Instead, the mystery developed gradually, one report after another, one unanswered question leading to the next. The quiet streets of Richmond provided little indication that they would become associated with one of Canada's most enduring criminal mysteries. Behind the ordinary appearance of suburban life, uncertainty was steadily replacing normality. For 7 years, that uncertainty would grow until it culminated in a discovery that transformed an unusual harassment investigation into one of the most debated death investigations in Canadian history. Before Cindy James became known as the subject of one of Canada's most puzzling death investigations, she was known simply as a nurse, a colleague, a daughter, a friend, and a woman trying to rebuild her life after the end of a marriage. Understanding who she was is essential because the unanswered questions surrounding her death have often overshadowed the person herself. Cindy James was born in 1944 and spent much of her adult life in British Columbia. She chose nursing as her profession, a career that demanded technical skill, long hours, and emotional resilience. Those who worked alongside her generally remembered her as someone who cared deeply about her patients and approached her responsibilities seriously. Nursing exposed her to illness, grief, and uncertainty on a regular basis. Yet it was also a profession built on trust and compassion. Outside of work, Cindy sought what many people seek: stability, meaningful relationships, and a comfortable home. She married physician Roy Makepeace, and together they established a life in Richmond, a suburban community near Vancouver. From an outside perspective, their lives appeared settled. Both had respected careers in healthcare, and there was little to suggest that the years ahead would become defined by fear and public scrutiny. Like many relationships, however, their marriage eventually came to an end. The couple separated in 1982. Public records do not establish a single cause for the breakdown of the marriage, and it is important not to speculate beyond the documented facts. What is clear is that the separation marked a major transition in Cindy's life. After the separation, she continued living independently and working as a nurse. Friends and family later described her as someone attempting to move forward despite the emotional challenges that often accompany divorce. She maintained relationships with relatives, co-workers, and acquaintances, and by many accounts she continued to fulfill her professional responsibilities. Within months, however, she began reporting a series of disturbing incidents. At first, they consisted primarily of anonymous telephone calls and threatening messages. Over time, the reports became more serious, including vandalism, suspicious activity around her home, and later alleged physical assaults. These events profoundly affected Cindy's daily life. Whether viewed through the lens of criminal victimization or psychological distress, the documented record shows that she repeatedly sought help from law enforcement and others because she believed she was in danger. As the years passed, the fear she described appeared to shape many aspects of her routine. She reported incidents to police on numerous occasions, cooperated with investigators, and eventually hired private investigator Ozzie Cabin in the hope that additional surveillance might identify whoever was responsible. These actions are consistent with the documented timeline of the case and illustrate that she was actively seeking assistance, rather than remaining isolated. The repeated investigations also placed Cindy under increasing public and professional scrutiny. Because no suspect could be identified despite extensive police involvement, questions gradually shifted from who might be threatening her to whether every reported incident could be explained by an external offender. This change in investigative focus proved deeply controversial. Some investigators and mental health professionals later suggested that aspects of the case might reflect underlying psychological difficulties. Others, including members of Cindy's family, friends, and her private investigator, firmly believed that she had been the target of a determined stalker whose identity was never discovered. These competing interpretations have remained central to discussions of the case for decades. It is important to distinguish between established facts and unresolved questions. The historical record confirms that Cindy made repeated reports to police over a period of approximately 7 years. It also confirms that investigators devoted substantial resources to examining those reports. What remains disputed is how all of those events should be interpreted. Accounts from people who knew Cindy often describe the emotional toll that the situation appeared to have on her. Living under the belief that someone intended to harm you can affect nearly every aspect of daily life. Routine activities such as returning home from work, answering the telephone, or noticing an unfamiliar vehicle in the neighborhood can become sources of anxiety. Regardless of the ultimate explanation for the reported incidents, The available evidence suggests that Cindy experienced prolonged distress during these years. Her case also illustrates a broader challenge faced by investigators when evidence is incomplete. Police are required to evaluate reports objectively, gathering physical evidence and testing competing explanations. Friends and family, by contrast, often interpret events through the lens of personal knowledge and emotional connection. In Cindy's case, those perspectives frequently diverged, contributing to the enduring debate that followed her death. By 1989, nearly 7 years after the first reported threats, Cindy's life had become inseparable from the unresolved investigation. The police files had grown substantially, yet no definitive suspect had been identified. The uncertainty that surrounded the reported harassment remained unresolved. What happened next transformed the case from an investigation into alleged stalking into one of the most debated unexplained deaths in Canadian history. The discovery of Cindy James's body would raise new questions that investigators, forensic specialists, and a coroner's jury would ultimately be unable to answer with certainty. The person whose life had already become the subject of years of investigation would now become the central figure in a mystery that remains unresolved decades later. By the spring of 1989, the investigation into the reports made by Cindy James had already stretched across nearly 7 years. During that time, police had documented numerous complaints involving threatening telephone calls, anonymous letters, suspected acts of vandalism, and several reported assaults. Despite extensive investigative efforts, no individual had been identified as the source of the reported harassment. The case remained unresolved as May 1989 came to an end. On May 25, 1989, Cindy followed what appeared to be an ordinary routine. According to the investigation, one of the last confirmed activities attributed to her was a visit to an automated teller machine, where she withdrew cash from her bank account. This ATM transaction became an important point in the official timeline, because it represented one of the final independently verified records of her movements. After that transaction, Cindy's whereabouts became uncertain. When she failed to return home and could not be contacted, concern grew among those who knew her. Given the years of reported threats and the history already documented by law enforcement, her disappearance immediately attracted serious attention. Investigators were faced with a difficult situation. They had no confirmed witness who could describe where she went after the ATM visit, and no verified evidence indicating whether she had left voluntarily or encountered another person. As the search continued, Cindy's vehicle was located in a parking area. The discovery of the car provided investigators with another confirmed element of the timeline, but it did not explain what had happened after she left it. Publicly available records do not establish with certainty why the vehicle was there, or how long it had remained in that location before being found. For approximately 2 weeks, Cindy remained missing. Then on June 8, 1989, a passerby discovered her body in the grounds of an abandoned property in Richmond, British Columbia. The location was not immediately visible from nearby roads because of tall grass and vegetation. Authorities responded to the scene and began documenting the physical evidence. Investigators observed that Cindy's hands and feet were bound behind her back in what has often been described as a hogtie position. A nylon stocking was found around her neck. Her clothing remained on her body, and investigators reported no obvious signs of a prolonged struggle at the immediate location where she was found. Because her body had been exposed to the environment for an extended period, decomposition had already begun, complicating some aspects of the forensic examination. The subsequent autopsy provided additional findings. Toxicological analysis determined that Cindy had lethal levels of morphine in her system, along with diazepam and flurazepam. Reports from the investigation noted that the concentration of morphine was significantly above the level generally considered fatal. However, forensic experts could not determine with certainty whether the morphine had entered her body by injection or by ingestion. These findings immediately raised difficult investigative questions. The physical evidence did not clearly establish the manner in which Cindy had died, nor did it identify another individual as being responsible. Detectives therefore had to consider multiple possibilities while remaining guided by the available evidence. The discovery also prompted investigators to re-examine the extensive history of reports Cindy had made during the previous 7 years. Every documented incident, every police report, and every interview became relevant once again. Detectives attempted to determine whether the circumstances surrounding her death were connected to the earlier allegations of harassment, or whether they reflected a different sequence of events. As the investigation progressed, competing interpretations emerged. Some investigators considered whether the evidence was consistent with homicide. Others questioned whether the available evidence supported an alternative explanation. Importantly, these differing views reflected the uncertainty of the evidence rather than a definitive conclusion. The complexity of the case meant that no single piece of evidence resolved the central questions. Instead, investigators were left with a collection of documented facts that did not point clearly toward one explanation. The discovery of Cindy James's body marked the beginning of a new phase of the investigation. What had previously been an inquiry into years of reported harassment became an investigation into an unexplained death. Despite extensive forensic examination and continued investigative efforts, the evidence gathered at the scene would ultimately prove insufficient to establish conclusively whether Cindy had been murdered, had died by suicide, or had died under some other set of circumstances. That uncertainty would shape every stage of the investigation that followed, and would remain central to the case for decades afterward. The discovery of Cindy James's body on June 8, 1989, marked a turning point in an investigation that had already challenged police for years. Until that day, investigators had been attempting to determine whether the repeated reports of harassment and assault were connected, and whether an unidentified individual was responsible. After the discovery, the investigation expanded into determining the cause and manner of Cindy's death. According to the investigative record, a passerby located Cindy's body on the grounds of an abandoned property in Richmond, British Columbia. The area was partially concealed by tall grass and vegetation, making it unlikely that the body would have been immediately visible to people passing nearby. Emergency services and investigators responded to the scene, which was secured for forensic examination. Crime scene investigators carefully documented the location before any evidence was moved. Standard procedures included photographing the scene, recording the position of the body, collecting physical evidence, and examining the surrounding area for signs of disturbance or indications that another person had been present. These steps are routine in unexplained death investigations and are intended to preserve information for later forensic analysis. Investigators observed that Cindy's hands and feet were bound behind her back in what has been described in investigative records as a hogtie position. A nylon stocking was wrapped around her neck. Her clothing remained in place, and investigators reported no immediately obvious evidence of a prolonged struggle at the location where the body was found. Because the body had remained outdoors for approximately 2 weeks, environmental exposure and decomposition limited the amount of forensic information that could be recovered. The surrounding area was examined for footprints, tire impressions, discarded items, fibers, biological material, and other trace evidence that might identify another individual or clarify how Cindy came to be at the location. Publicly available information indicates that investigators were unable to recover evidence that conclusively identified another person at the scene. The autopsy became a critical component of the investigation. Forensic pathologists examined Cindy's body to determine both the medical cause of death and any injuries that might indicate how the events had unfolded. Toxicological testing revealed the presence of morphine, diazepam, and flurazepam. The concentration of morphine was reported to be well above the level generally considered fatal. Although the toxicology findings established that the drugs played a significant role in Cindy's death, they did not answer several important investigative questions. Experts were unable to determine with certainty whether the morphine had been administered by injection or ingested orally. That distinction was important because it affected how investigators evaluated competing explanations for the case. The forensic examination also had to consider whether the physical bindings represented evidence of restraint by another individual, or whether they could have been applied under different circumstances. Public reporting on the case has reflected differing expert opinions over the years, illustrating why the evidence remained open to interpretation rather than leading to a single definitive conclusion. Investigators also reviewed the extensive history of incidents reported by Cindy between 1982 and 1989. Each prior complaint was re-examined in light of the new evidence. Detectives compared witness statements, police reports, medical records, and forensic findings to determine whether any earlier event provided a direct investigative lead. The review highlighted one of the central difficulties of the case. While many incidents had been documented over the years, they did not collectively identify a suspect. Some reports included physical evidence of property damage or injuries, while others relied primarily on Cindy's account of what had occurred. The available evidence did not establish a consistent pattern that could conclusively identify another individual. As forensic work continued, investigators also examined Cindy's personal and professional life. They interviewed family members, friends, co-workers, neighbors, and others who had regular contact with her. The objective was to identify any potential conflicts, relationships, or circumstances that might explain either the reported harassment or her death. These interviews generated information that investigators considered during the broader inquiry, but none produced evidence sufficient to resolve the central questions. The investigation remained complicated because each significant finding appeared to raise additional uncertainties. The toxicology results established that lethal drugs were present, but not how they had been administered. The bindings were documented, but their significance remained disputed. The history of reported harassment was extensive, yet investigators could not conclusively connect it to another identifiable individual. As evidence accumulated, detectives increasingly considered more than one possible explanation for Cindy's death. Rather than reaching an immediate conclusion, investigators continued evaluating the available facts against multiple hypotheses, recognizing that the evidence did not clearly support only one interpretation. The discovery of Cindy James's body therefore did not bring immediate clarity to the case. Instead, it transformed an already unusual investigation into one of Canada's most debated unexplained death inquiries. The forensic evidence established important facts, but those facts did not fully explain the circumstances that led to her death. In the years that followed, investigators, forensic specialists, mental health professionals, journalists, and legal authorities would continue examining the evidence from different perspectives. Their efforts would ultimately shape two competing theories. One suggesting that Cindy had been the victim of homicide, the other proposing that the events could be explained without the involvement of an unidentified attacker. Neither theory, however, would fully account for every documented fact, leaving the case unresolved and the manner of death officially classified as an unknown event. The investigation into the death of Cindy James did not begin on the day her body was discovered. In many respects, it had already been underway for nearly 7 years. By June 1989, police had accumulated an extensive record of reports, interviews, photographs, forensic examinations, and investigative notes concerning the incidents Cindy had reported since 1982. Her death required investigators to reassess that entire history in an effort to determine whether the events formed a single, coherent pattern or represented unrelated occurrences. Following the discovery of her body, investigators from the Royal Canadian Mounted Police reviewed every documented complaint Cindy had made. This included reports of threatening telephone calls, anonymous letters, vandalism, suspected surveillance, and alleged assaults. Detectives compared witness statements, forensic findings, medical records, and police reports to identify any recurring names, locations, methods, or other links that might point to a suspect. The review confirmed that Cindy had made numerous reports over several years. It also confirmed that law enforcement had responded repeatedly to those reports. However, despite the volume of investigative material, detectives were unable to identify an individual who could be conclusively connected to the alleged campaign of harassment or to Cindy's death. As investigators examined the evidence, two broad investigative theories emerged. The first theory proposed that Cindy had been the victim of an unidentified stalker who had harassed her for years and ultimately killed her. Supporters of this interpretation pointed to the consistency of her reports over time, the existence of documented property damage, and several incidents in which physical injuries had been observed. Some witnesses also reported hearing threatening telephone calls or observing suspicious activity near Cindy's home. These observations suggested that at least some of the reported incidents involved events that others had independently perceived. The second theory considered whether some or all of the reported incidents might not have involved an unknown offender. Investigators noted that, despite years of police attention, surveillance efforts, and forensic examinations, no suspect had been identified and no physical evidence had conclusively established the presence of a persistent stalker. This led some investigators and consulting mental health professionals to explore whether psychological factors might explain portions of the reported history. Neither theory fully accounted for all of the available evidence. This became the central challenge of the investigation. Evidence that appeared to support one interpretation often left other documented facts unexplained. Likewise, information that raised questions about one theory did not necessarily establish the alternative. Investigators also reviewed Cindy's personal relationships, employment history, financial records, and daily routines. Interviews were conducted with family members, friends, neighbors, co-workers, and others who had regular contact with her. The purpose of these interviews was to identify any conflicts, threats, or relationships that might provide an investigative lead. While these interviews helped investigators better understand Cindy's circumstances, they did not produce evidence identifying a person responsible for her death. Particular attention was given to forensic evidence collected over the course of the investigation. Detectives examined whether fingerprints, fibers, biological material, or other trace evidence recovered from earlier incidents or from the scene where Cindy's body was found could establish the involvement of another individual. Publicly available records indicate that these examinations did not produce evidence sufficient to identify a suspect. The toxicology findings also remained difficult to interpret. While forensic testing established the presence of lethal levels of morphine, along with diazepam and flurazepam, investigators could not determine with certainty how those substances had entered Cindy's body. Without that information, the toxicological evidence alone could not establish whether another person had administered the drugs. Questions also remained regarding the bindings found on Cindy's body. Investigators considered whether they represented evidence of restraint by another individual, or whether alternative explanations were possible. Different experts reached different conclusions regarding the significance of these findings, illustrating the limits of the available evidence. The investigation attracted considerable public attention. Media coverage frequently highlighted the unusual nature of the case, while books, documentaries, and later analyses continued to examine competing explanations. Over time, the case became one of Canada's best-known unresolved death investigations, not because investigators lacked evidence entirely, but because the evidence supported more than one plausible interpretation without conclusively proving any of them. Recognizing the continuing uncertainty, authorities convened a coroner's inquest to examine the available evidence. The inquest reviewed testimony from investigators, forensic specialists, medical professionals, and other witnesses. Its purpose was not to determine criminal responsibility, but to evaluate the circumstances surrounding Cindy's death and consider what conclusions could reasonably be supported by the evidence. After reviewing the available information, the inquiry concluded that the evidence did not establish homicide beyond the available facts, nor did it support a definitive finding of suicide. Instead, the manner of death remained unresolved. The official classification reflected this uncertainty by describing the death as an unknown event. That conclusion remains significant because it reflects the limits of the available evidence rather than a determination in favor of any particular theory. Decades later, researchers, journalists, forensic experts, and members of the public continue to debate the case. Some view the evidence as more consistent with an unidentified offender, while others consider alternative explanations more persuasive. Neither position has been conclusively established. As a result, the investigation into Cindy James has become an important case study in criminal investigation, forensic interpretation, and the challenges that arise when evidence does not point clearly to a single conclusion. More than 30 years after her death, the central question remains unanswered. What exactly happened to Cindy James during the final days of her life? The available evidence has never provided a definitive response, and the case continues to be regarded as one of the most perplexing unresolved investigations in Canadian criminal history. Unlike many criminal investigations, the case of Cindy James did not reach a single decisive breakthrough that identified a suspect or clarified the circumstances of her death. Instead, the investigation reached a turning point through a gradual recognition that the available evidence supported more than one plausible interpretation, while conclusively proving none of them. Following the discovery of Cindy's body and the completion of the forensic examinations, investigators returned to the extensive investigative record that had accumulated between 1982 and 1989. Every reported incident was reviewed in chronological order. Detectives sought to determine whether the documented events could be explained by a single offender, by multiple unrelated events, or by another interpretation entirely. This comprehensive review represented an important shift in the investigation. During the earlier years, individual incidents had largely been examined as separate occurrences requiring immediate police response. After Cindy's death, investigators instead evaluated the entire 7-year history as one continuous case. The review revealed both patterns and inconsistencies. Certain reports appeared to fit a continuing narrative of repeated harassment. Threatening telephone calls had been documented over several years. Property damage had been observed on multiple occasions. Cindy had repeatedly sought assistance from police, medical professionals, and a private investigator. Family members, friends, and co-workers described her as expressing genuine fear about her safety. At the same time, investigators also noted the absence of evidence that would normally be expected in a long-term stalking investigation. Despite years of police involvement, surveillance efforts, and forensic examinations, no suspect had been identified, no consistent physical evidence linked an offender to the reported incidents, and no witness was able to provide information sufficient to establish the identity of a person responsible. This combination of documented reports and limited corroborating evidence became the defining challenge of the investigation. Rather than moving steadily toward one conclusion, the evidence appeared to divide into competing interpretations. Investigators therefore focused increasingly on evaluating the strengths and limitations of each theory instead of searching exclusively for a traditional suspect. The first theory remained that Cindy had been the victim of an unidentified individual who had harassed her over many years and ultimately caused her death. Supporters of this view emphasized the consistency of her reports, the existence of documented property damage, witness accounts of threatening telephone calls, and physical injuries that had been observed during some reported incidents. They argued that these factors suggested the presence of an external offender, whose identity had simply never been established. The alternative interpretation examined whether some reported events might have originated from circumstances other than an unidentified stalker. Investigators considered the absence of direct forensic evidence connecting another individual to the incidents, together with differing professional opinions regarding Cindy's psychological condition. These considerations led some investigators to question whether the available evidence supported every allegation in the investigative record. Importantly, neither interpretation resolved every unanswered question. Investigators found that evidence supporting one explanation frequently left other aspects of the case unexplained. Likewise, information that appeared inconsistent with one theory did not automatically establish the other. As additional expert opinions were obtained, forensic specialists and medical professionals evaluated the toxicology findings, the bindings found on Cindy's body, and the available physical evidence. Publicly available records indicate that expert interpretations differed in several respects. Some findings were viewed as more consistent with homicide, while others were considered compatible with alternative explanations. The absence of a clear forensic consensus reinforced the uncertainty already present in the investigation. The coroner's inquest became another significant stage in the process. Witnesses, investigators, and experts presented evidence concerning Cindy's life, the reported incidents, and the circumstances surrounding her death. The purpose of the inquest was to review the available evidence objectively rather than determine criminal responsibility. Following its review, the inquiry concluded that the available evidence did not support a definitive finding that Cindy had been murdered. At the same time, It also found that the evidence was insufficient to conclude that she had died by suicide. This outcome reflected the central difficulty that had characterized the investigation from the beginning. Although many facts had been established, those facts did not combine into a single, definitive explanation. The resulting classification of the death as an unknown event represented the investigation's most significant conclusion. Rather than identifying a breakthrough that solved the case, investigators reached the point at which they recognized that the available evidence could not reliably distinguish among the competing possibilities. This outcome has shaped public discussion of the case ever since. Researchers, journalists, legal scholars, and forensic specialists continue to examine the investigative record, often reaching different conclusions about the same body of evidence. Some view the documented history of reported threats and assaults as supporting the existence of an unidentified offender. Others consider the absence of corroborating forensic evidence to be more significant. Neither interpretation has displaced the official conclusion, because neither fully accounts for all of the known facts. In this respect, the turning point in the investigation was not the discovery of new evidence, but the realization that further analysis of the existing evidence had reached its limits. Investigators had reconstructed the timeline, interviewed witnesses, reviewed forensic findings, and explored competing hypotheses. Despite these efforts, the investigation did not produce evidence sufficient to establish a definitive manner of death. As a result, the case of Cindy James remains one of the most extensively examined unresolved death investigations in Canada. Its significance lies not only in the unanswered questions surrounding Cindy's final days, but also in the broader investigative lesson it presents. Even a lengthy and well-resourced investigation may conclude with uncertainty when the available evidence supports multiple reasonable interpretations without conclusively proving any one of them. Unlike many high-profile criminal cases, the death of Cindy James did not culminate in the arrest of a suspect, a criminal trial, or a verdict determining guilt or innocence. Instead, the legal process focused on examining the available evidence to determine what conclusions could reasonably be supported. The absence of a prosecution reflected not a lack of investigative effort, but the inability of the evidence to establish criminal responsibility. Following the discovery of Cindy's body on June 8, 1989, investigators continued gathering and reviewing evidence. The forensic examination, witness interviews, and analysis of the investigative record generated substantial information regarding the circumstances surrounding her death. However, none of the evidence identified an individual who could be charged with causing her death. Because no suspect was identified, the matter did not proceed through the criminal courts in the manner typical of homicide cases. Instead, the investigation remained focused on determining the manner of death through the available forensic and investigative evidence. A coroner's inquest was convened to examine the circumstances surrounding Cindy's death. The purpose of such an inquiry is distinct from that of a criminal trial. Rather than determining whether a specific individual committed an offense, a coroner's inquest reviews the available evidence to establish, where possible, who died, when and where the death occurred, and the medical cause and manner of death. The proceedings consider testimony from investigators, forensic specialists, medical professionals, and other relevant witnesses. During the review, the inquiry considered the extensive history of reports Cindy had made during the 7 years preceding her death. Investigators described the numerous complaints involving threatening telephone calls, anonymous correspondence, reported assaults, and suspected acts of harassment. Forensic experts presented the results of the autopsy and toxicological analysis, while investigators explained the efforts undertaken to identify a suspect. The evidence demonstrated that Cindy had died with lethal concentrations of morphine, together with diazepam and flurazepam, in her system. The physical findings, including the bindings discovered on her body, were also examined. However, despite extensive testimony, the available evidence did not establish with certainty how the drugs had been administered or whether another individual had been directly responsible for the circumstances leading to her death. The inquiry also considered the differing interpretations offered during the investigation. Some evidence was viewed by certain participants as being consistent with homicide, particularly when considered alongside Cindy's years of reported harassment. Others emphasized the absence of direct forensic evidence identifying another individual and questioned whether the available information supported a conclusion that an unidentified offender had caused her death. Importantly, these differing interpretations reflected the uncertainty of the evidence rather than definitive findings. The inquiry did not resolve the long-standing debate regarding the meaning of the investigative record, because the evidence itself remained open to more than one reasonable interpretation. After reviewing the testimony and available forensic evidence, the coroner's jury reached a conclusion that reflected these limitations. The evidence was insufficient to determine conclusively that Cindy had been murdered. At the same time, the evidence did not support a definitive conclusion that she had died by suicide. Accordingly, the manner of death was classified as an unknown event. This classification remains significant because it acknowledges that the available evidence does not permit a definitive legal or forensic conclusion regarding how Cindy's death occurred. It is neither a finding of homicide nor a finding of suicide. Instead, it recognizes that the investigation, despite extensive efforts, could not establish one explanation to the exclusion of all others. The legal consequences of that conclusion were substantial. Without sufficient evidence identifying a suspect or establishing criminal responsibility, no criminal charges could be filed. Likewise, because the evidence did not conclusively establish suicide, the investigation could not be regarded as having resolved the circumstances of Cindy's death through that explanation either. As a result, the case remained officially unresolved. In the decades since the inquest, investigators, journalists, forensic specialists, and researchers have continued to examine the available evidence. New analyses have revisited the forensic findings, the investigative record, and the competing theories that emerged during the original inquiry. While these later discussions have contributed to public understanding of the case, they have not altered the official legal conclusion. Today, Cindy James's case occupies an unusual place in Canadian legal and investigative history. It is frequently cited as an example of the challenges that arise when extensive investigative work produces a substantial body of evidence, but no definitive explanation. The case demonstrates that even a thorough investigation, supported by forensic analysis and years of police work, may ultimately reach the limits of what the available evidence can establish. The legal process fulfilled its role by carefully examining the known facts and applying the appropriate evidentiary standards. Where certainty could not be achieved, the official conclusion reflected that uncertainty rather than extending beyond what the evidence could support. For that reason, the case remains open in the broader historical sense, continuing to be studied as one of Canada's most complex and enduring unresolved death investigations. Decades after the death of Cindy James, the case remains one of Canada's most widely discussed unresolved investigations. Time has passed, investigative methods have advanced, and countless analyses have examined the available evidence. Yet the central questions surrounding her final days remain unanswered. The lasting impact of the case does not come only from the mystery of Cindy's death. It also comes from the complexity of the circumstances that surrounded her life during the years before it. For 7 years, Cindy reported a series of disturbing incidents that she believed were connected by an unknown individual. Those reports became the foundation of one of the most unusual investigations undertaken by Canadian law enforcement. After her death, the focus of the investigation changed. The question was no longer only who might have been responsible for the reported harassment, but whether the years of events could be connected to the circumstances of her death. Investigators faced the difficult task of examining a history that contained both documented incidents and unresolved questions. The case also became a broader discussion about the challenges faced by victims who report long-term harassment or stalking. When a person repeatedly describes feeling threatened, investigators must balance two responsibilities: taking the report seriously, while also evaluating evidence carefully and objectively. The Cindy James case remains controversial partly because it highlights how difficult that balance can become when evidence does not provide a clear answer. For Cindy's family and those who believed her accounts, the lack of a definitive explanation represented a painful absence of closure. They continued to maintain that she had experienced real danger, and that the person responsible for her suffering had never been identified. For others involved in reviewing the case, the unanswered questions surrounding the evidence remained impossible to ignore. The debate surrounding the case has continued through books, documentaries, articles, and discussions among people interested in criminal investigations. Each examination of the case has returned to the same fundamental issue. How should conflicting pieces of evidence be interpreted when no explanation accounts for every known fact? Those who believe Cindy was the victim of an unknown offender point to the long history of reported threats, the physical evidence associated with some incidents, and the possibility that a determined individual could avoid detection over time. They argue that the absence of an identified suspect does not necessarily prove that no offender existed. Those who question that interpretation emphasize the lack of conclusive forensic evidence linking another person to Cindy's death. The failure to identify a suspect despite significant investigative resources, and the complexity of the circumstances surrounding the reported incidents. They argue that uncertainty must remain part of any responsible assessment of the case. Neither perspective has produced a final answer. That is what makes the Cindy James case endure. It is not a story with a traditional conclusion where investigators reveal a name, a motive, and a sequence of events that explains everything. Instead, it remains a case defined by unanswered questions, conflicting interpretations, and the limits of available evidence. From an investigative perspective, the case demonstrates the importance of preserving evidence, carefully documenting reports, and recognizing the difference between suspicion and proof. A theory may appear convincing, but criminal investigations require evidence strong enough to support a conclusion beyond uncertainty. From a human perspective, the case is a reminder that behind every investigation is a real person whose life existed beyond the headlines and theories. Cindy James was not only the subject of a mystery. She was a nurse, a colleague, a friend, and a member of a family who experienced years of uncertainty before her death. The unresolved nature of her story has ensured that she remains remembered not because the mystery was solved, but because it was never fully explained. The official conclusion of an unknown event reflects the reality of the case. Investigators established many facts, but those facts did not lead to a single proven explanation. The evidence revealed what could be known, while also showing the boundaries of what could not be determined. More than 30 years later, the case of Cindy James continues to raise difficult questions about evidence, memory, investigation, and the search for truth. It remains one of Canada's most complex mysteries, not because there are no possible explanations, but because none has been proven with enough certainty to end the debate. And perhaps that is the most lasting aspect of the case. Some investigations end with answers. Others remain as reminders that despite technology, expertise, and years of searching, the truth can sometimes remain just beyond reach. More than 3 decades after Cindy James was found dead in Richmond, British Columbia, her case continues to attract attention from investigators, researchers, and those interested in unresolved criminal mysteries. Unlike cases that end with an arrest or a confession, the Cindy James investigation remains defined by uncertainty. The unanswered questions have become the central feature of the case itself. The passage of time has not eliminated the debate. Instead, it has created more opportunities for people to examine the available information from different perspectives. New generations of investigators and researchers have revisited the timeline, the police reports, the forensic findings, and the testimony connected to the case. Yet despite repeated examinations, no explanation has been universally accepted as the definitive answer. One reason the case remains so complex is that it exists at the intersection of several difficult areas: criminal investigation, forensic science, and human psychology. From an investigative perspective, the case demonstrates the challenges of working with incomplete evidence. Police investigations depend on establishing connections between events, identifying suspects, and building a chain of evidence that can withstand scrutiny. In Cindy's case, investigators were faced with a large amount of information, but the information did not produce the type of clear pattern that usually leads to a criminal charge. The investigation contained many documented events, but documentation alone does not always provide certainty. A report can establish that a complaint was made. A photograph can record damage. A medical examination can confirm an injury. However, Determining who was responsible and why an event occurred requires additional evidence. This distinction became one of the most important issues surrounding the case. Supporters of the homicide theory have argued that the years of reported threats and attacks should not be dismissed simply because investigators failed to identify a suspect. They point to the possibility that a careful offender could avoid detection, especially if the person understood Cindy's routines and remained cautious. Others have focused on the lack of physical evidence connecting an outside person to the final events of Cindy's life. They argue that responsible investigation requires considering every possibility and recognizing when the evidence does not support a single conclusion. The disagreement between these viewpoints reflects a broader challenge in true crime investigations: the difference between what is possible and what can be proven. Many explanations may appear reasonable. However, criminal investigations are not based only on possibilities. They require evidence strong enough to support a conclusion. The Cindy James case also influenced discussions about stalking and victim response. During the years before her death, Cindy repeatedly reported feeling threatened. The case raised questions about how authorities should respond when a person reports persistent harassment, but the identity of the alleged offender cannot be confirmed. Modern approaches to stalking investigations often emphasize documentation, risk assessment, victim support, and early intervention. While the Cindy James case cannot provide simple answers, it remains part of the larger conversation about how institutions respond to people who report fear and danger. At the same time, the case also highlights the importance of maintaining fairness and objectivity. Investigators must protect potential victims, while also carefully evaluating evidence. Both responsibilities are essential to a functioning justice system. For Cindy's family and those who knew her, the unresolved nature of the case meant living without a final explanation. There was no courtroom conclusion, no confirmed offender, and no complete reconstruction of what happened. The official classification of her death as an unknown event reflected the reality that the evidence did not allow investigators to go further. For the public, the case became a symbol of uncertainty. It represents the uncomfortable reality that some investigations, even after years of effort and significant resources, do not end with clear answers. The absence of a final conclusion does not mean the investigation was meaningless. Instead, it shows the limits of what evidence can reveal. The story of Cindy James continues to be studied because it raises questions that extend beyond one individual case. How should investigators evaluate unusual patterns of behavior? How should evidence be interpreted when multiple explanations remain possible? How can authorities protect people while maintaining objective standards of proof? These questions remain relevant in criminal investigations today. Ultimately, the legacy of the Cindy James case is not only the mystery surrounding her death. It is also the reminder that every investigation involves uncertainty, and that the search for truth requires patience, evidence, and caution. The case remains unresolved not because there was no investigation, but because the investigation reached a point where the available evidence could not provide a final answer. And that is why, decades later, Cindy James remains one of Canada's most discussed unresolved cases. A case where the facts are known, the questions are many, and the complete truth remains uncertain. The case of Cindy James remains significant because it represents one of the most difficult situations faced by investigators. A case where there is a large amount of information, but no single explanation that can be proven beyond doubt. In many criminal investigations, the process follows a familiar path. Investigators identify a victim, establish a timeline, collect physical evidence, locate suspects, and eventually present a conclusion. The Cindy James case followed a very different path. The investigation began years before her death, continued through numerous reports and examinations, and ultimately reached a point where the evidence could not provide a definitive answer. One of the most important lessons from the case is the importance of separating documented facts from interpretations. The documented facts include that Cindy James reported repeated incidents over several years, that police investigated many of those reports, that her body was discovered in 1989, and that forensic testing revealed the presence of multiple substances in her system. These facts form the foundation of the investigation. The interpretations of those facts are where disagreement begins. Some observers interpret the pattern of reported events as evidence of a persistent unknown offender. They argue that the number of incidents, the emotional impact on Cindy, and certain physical findings suggest that an outside person may have been involved. Others focus on the absence of evidence identifying such a person. They argue that after years of investigation, surveillance, and forensic review, the lack of a confirmed suspect must be considered when evaluating the possibilities. This difference highlights a fundamental principle of criminal investigation. Evidence must be evaluated as a whole. Individual pieces of information can appear convincing when viewed separately, but investigators must consider whether all pieces form a consistent and provable explanation. In Cindy's case, the evidence created questions but did not provide a final answer. The case also demonstrates the difficulty of investigating events that occur over a long period of time. Evidence can become harder to collect as time passes. Witness memories may change. Physical evidence may disappear. Circumstances surrounding earlier events may no longer be available for examination. When Cindy's death occurred in 1989, investigators were not only examining the final incident, they were also reviewing years of previous reports, attempting to determine whether those events were connected, and whether they revealed information about what happened at the end of her life. Another important aspect of the case is the role of professional judgment. Police officers, forensic specialists, and medical experts must often make decisions based on incomplete information. They must consider different possibilities without allowing assumptions to replace evidence. The Cindy James investigation demonstrates how difficult that process can become when evidence points in different directions. The case also raises questions about how society understands victims of reported threats or harassment. When someone repeatedly reports being targeted, the response requires both compassion and careful investigation. The goal is to provide protection while also ensuring that conclusions are based on reliable evidence. At the same time, unresolved cases often create a desire for simple explanations. People naturally search for a clear beginning, a clear cause, and a clear ending. However, some investigations do not provide that structure. The reality of criminal investigation is that some cases remain incomplete because the available evidence does not allow certainty. For those who continue studying Cindy James's case, the unanswered questions remain the most challenging part. Was there an unknown individual responsible for the events she reported? Were all of the reported incidents connected? Did the circumstances surrounding her death involve another person? Or does another explanation better account for the available evidence? These questions have remained open for decades. The official conclusion of an unknown event does not provide a satisfying resolution for many people, but it reflects the limits of what investigators could establish. It acknowledges that important facts were known while also recognizing that the full sequence of events could not be proven. The lasting importance of the case is therefore not only in the mystery itself, it is also in what it teaches about investigation, evidence, uncertainty, and the responsibility of searching for truth without going beyond what the facts can support. The story of Cindy James continues to be examined because it represents a difficult reality. Sometimes an investigation can reveal many pieces of a puzzle, while still leaving the complete picture unfinished. The case of Cindy James has remained in public memory for decades because it represents a rare type of investigation, one where the questions surrounding the case became almost as significant as the facts themselves. Many criminal cases are remembered because they contain a clear sequence of events. There is often a moment when investigators discover a crucial piece of evidence, identify a suspect, and reconstruct what happened. The Cindy James case followed a different path. The investigation produced a large amount of information, but the evidence never formed a complete explanation that could be proven. This uncertainty became the defining feature of the case. After the coroner's inquest concluded that Cindy's death was an unknown event, the case did not disappear. Instead, it continued to attract attention from journalists, researchers, forensic specialists, and members of the public. Each examination of the case returned to the same central problem: how should the available evidence be interpreted? The case is often discussed because it challenges the idea that every investigation must eventually produce a clear answer. In reality, investigations depend on evidence, and evidence has limitations. Even when authorities conduct extensive interviews, forensic testing, and reviews of records, there are situations where the information available is not enough to establish exactly what occurred. Cindy's case also became an example of how difficult it can be to evaluate events that develop over many years. The reports made between 1982 and 1989 created a complicated timeline. Investigators had to determine which events could be independently verified, which details could be supported by physical evidence, and which questions remained unresolved. Time itself became an important factor. When incidents are investigated years after they occur, information can become increasingly difficult to confirm. Memories change. Circumstances shift. Evidence may no longer exist. This creates additional challenges for investigators attempting to reconstruct a sequence of events. Another reason the case continues to attract discussion is the involvement of different areas of expertise. Law enforcement examined the case from the perspective of criminal evidence. Medical professionals considered the physical and psychological aspects. Legal authorities evaluated what conclusions could be supported by available information. Each perspective contributed something important, but none provided a complete solution. The case also demonstrates the difference between suspicion and proof. Many explanations may appear possible, especially in a case with unusual circumstances. However, possibility alone is not enough to establish responsibility. Criminal justice systems require evidence that can withstand careful examination. This principle is one of the reasons the official conclusion remained unchanged. Although various theories have been proposed over the years, none has been supported by enough evidence to become an established explanation. For many people who study unresolved cases, the Cindy James investigation represents the importance of maintaining an open mind while also respecting the limits of evidence. Accepting uncertainty can be difficult, especially when the circumstances involve a person's death and years of unanswered questions. The case also continues to raise discussions about how society responds when someone reports being threatened or harmed. It highlights the importance of taking concerns seriously, while ensuring that investigations remain based on objective evaluation rather than assumptions. Beyond the investigation itself, Cindy James's story remains connected to broader conversations about fear, safety, mental health, and the challenges of understanding complex human experiences. These discussions require sensitivity because the case involves a real person whose life extended far beyond the mystery that followed her death. Cindy was not only part of an investigation file. She was a nurse, a friend, a family member, and an individual whose life became the focus of questions that continued long after her death. That human element is one of the most important aspects of remembering the case. The passage of time has not produced a final answer. No new evidence has conclusively resolved the competing theories. The official finding remains the same. The circumstances surrounding Cindy James's death could not be determined with certainty. The mystery continues not because the investigation was ignored, but because the evidence reached its limits. The case of Cindy James remains a reminder that some investigations do not end with a final revelation. Some remain as complex historical records, collections of facts, unanswered questions, and competing interpretations that continue to be examined by those searching for a clearer understanding of what happened. The story of Cindy James has remained in public discussion not only because of the mystery surrounding her death, but because of the difficult questions the case raised about investigation, evidence, and the way society responds to uncertainty. When the case first gained attention, much of the focus centered on one question: what happened to Cindy James? However, as the years passed, the discussion expanded beyond the circumstances of her death. The case became an example of the challenges involved when investigators must work with incomplete information, conflicting interpretations, and events that cannot be fully reconstructed. One of the most significant aspects of the case is the long period before Cindy's death. The investigation did not begin with a single dramatic event. Instead, it developed over years through a series of reports and responses. This created a complicated situation because investigators were not simply examining one incident. They were attempting to understand a pattern. Patterns are important in criminal investigations because repeated events can reveal connections that individual incidents may not show. However, identifying a pattern also requires careful analysis. Investigators must determine whether separate events truly share a common cause, or whether similarities may be coincidental. The Cindy James investigation demonstrated how difficult that process can be. The reported incidents created a history that could not be easily ignored. At the same time, the absence of a confirmed offender created uncertainty. Investigators were forced to consider multiple possibilities while avoiding conclusions that could not be supported by evidence. This challenge is common in complex investigations. Evidence rarely appears as a complete picture. Instead, investigators often work with fragments, statements, physical findings, timelines, and expert opinions. The goal is to determine how those fragments fit together. In Cindy's case, the fragments never formed a single explanation that everyone could agree upon. The case also influenced discussions about the role of forensic evidence. Modern audiences often expect science to provide definitive answers. However, forensic evidence has limits. It can reveal important information, but it cannot always explain every event or identify responsibility without additional supporting evidence. The toxicology findings, the circumstances surrounding the discovery of Cindy's body, and the previous history of reported incidents all provided important information. Yet none of these elements alone created a complete explanation. This distinction between information and certainty became central to the case. The investigation also showed the importance of considering different perspectives. Law enforcement, medical professionals, family members, and independent observers often viewed the same events through different experiences and responsibilities. Family members and supporters focused on Cindy's reports and the fear she expressed during the years before her death. Investigators focused on evidence, verification, and what could be proven. Mental health professionals examined possible explanations from a psychological perspective. These viewpoints did not always lead to the same conclusions. However, disagreement itself does not mean that one side has ignored the facts. In complicated cases, different interpretations can emerge because the evidence allows more than one possibility. Another lasting impact of the Cindy James case is the way it influenced conversations about unresolved investigations. Many people are familiar with cases that end with a clear conclusion, but unresolved cases reveal a different reality. Sometimes investigators can determine many details while still being unable to answer the most important question. The absence of a final answer can be frustrating for families, investigators, and the public. People naturally seek closure, especially when a person's death remains unexplained. However, investigations must be based on evidence rather than the desire for a simple conclusion. The official classification of Cindy's death as an unknown event represents this principle. It acknowledges that important findings were established while recognizing that the available evidence did not allow investigators to determine exactly what happened. The case continues to be discussed because it remains a reminder of the complexity of human behavior and criminal investigation. It shows that some cases are not difficult because there is no information, but because the information does not lead to one certain interpretation. Years after Cindy James's death, the investigation remains a subject of study because it raises questions that extend beyond one individual case. How should investigators handle reports that cannot immediately be proven? How can authorities protect people while maintaining objective standards? How should evidence be evaluated when different explanations remain possible? These questions continue to matter in modern investigations. The legacy of Cindy James is therefore not only the mystery surrounding her final days. It is also the broader discussion her case created about evidence, uncertainty, and the search for truth. Some cases end with answers. Others remain as reminders that the pursuit of truth sometimes leads not to certainty, but to a deeper understanding of how complex and challenging investigations can become. The case of Cindy James remains one of those investigations where the passage of time has not erased the questions surrounding it. Instead, the years have transformed the case into a subject of continued analysis, with different researchers examining the same evidence and reaching different conclusions. The reason the case remains compelling is not simply because it is unresolved. Many investigations remain open for long periods. What makes this case unusual is the combination of a long history of reported incidents, extensive police involvement, complex forensic findings, and the absence of a conclusion that fully explains every known detail. In reviewing the case, investigators and researchers often return to the timeline. Understanding the sequence of events is essential because the meaning of each individual incident depends heavily on where it appears within the larger history. The reports made by Cindy between 1982 and 1989 created a complicated investigative record. Each report required evaluation, documentation, and follow-up. Some incidents involved claims that could be examined through physical evidence or witness statements. Others depended primarily on Cindy's own account of what had occurred. This created a challenge that investigators frequently encounter: determining how much weight should be given to different types of evidence. Physical evidence can often provide measurable information, but even physical evidence may not answer every question. A damaged object, a medical finding, or a forensic result can confirm that something happened, but it may not always reveal who was responsible or why it occurred. Statements and personal accounts are also important because they can provide information that physical evidence cannot capture. However, they must be evaluated carefully, especially in complex cases where multiple explanations are possible. The Cindy James investigation demonstrates the importance of combining different forms of evidence rather than relying on a single source of information. Another reason the case continues to receive attention is the question of uncertainty itself. Modern crime reporting often focuses on solved cases because they provide a clear narrative. An event occurs, investigators find evidence, a suspect is identified, and a conclusion is reached. Unresolved cases challenge that structure. They remind the public that investigations are not always straightforward. Sometimes the evidence available is incomplete. Sometimes witnesses provide different perspectives. Sometimes experts disagree about what the evidence means. In these situations, investigators must accept uncertainty rather than force an explanation that the evidence cannot support. The Cindy James case also remains relevant because it highlights the importance of reviewing cases from multiple perspectives. Looking only through one lens can create an incomplete understanding. From a law enforcement perspective, the focus is on evidence, verification, and establishing facts. From a medical perspective, the focus is on understanding physical findings and possible causes. From a personal perspective, family and friends often focus on the experiences and emotions of the person involved. Each perspective contributes to understanding the case, but each also has limitations. The continuing discussion surrounding Cindy James has also influenced how people think about cases involving reported harassment and stalking. Today, stalking investigations often emphasize early documentation, risk assessment, and coordinated responses between authorities and support services. Although the Cindy James case cannot provide a simple explanation for every situation, it remains part of the broader history of discussions about how reports of threats should be evaluated and addressed. Perhaps the most difficult aspect of the case is that it leaves people searching for certainty that the evidence has never provided. Those who believe Cindy was harmed by another person continue to point to the history of reported incidents and the possibility of an unidentified offender. Those who question that conclusion continue to point to the absence of conclusive evidence identifying such a person. Both interpretations continue to exist because the investigation never produced the evidence necessary to eliminate all uncertainty. The official finding of an unknown event remains the most accurate reflection of that reality. It does not answer every question, but it represents the conclusion reached after reviewing the available information. The legacy of the Cindy James case is therefore not only about mystery, it is about the difficult process of searching for truth when the available evidence is incomplete. It reminds investigators, researchers, and the public that unanswered questions do not always mean that nothing was discovered. Sometimes they mean that the evidence revealed important facts but could not reveal the complete story. And that is why, decades later, the case continues to be examined. Not because the investigation was forgotten, but because the search for understanding remains unfinished. The case of Cindy James has endured for decades because, even after extensive investigation, it continues to exist between what is known and what remains uncertain. investigators established many important facts. Cindy James was a nurse living in British Columbia. She reported a series of disturbing incidents over several years. Police responded to those reports and conducted investigations. After her disappearance in 1989, her body was discovered, forensic testing was performed, and an inquest examined the circumstances surrounding her death. Yet the most important question remained unanswered. What exactly happened during the final days of Cindy's life? The absence of a definitive answer has caused the case to remain a subject of debate. Different people have examined the same information and reached different conclusions because the evidence does not point clearly in only one direction. For those who believe Cindy was the victim of an unknown offender, the history of reported threats and incidents represents a significant part of the investigation. They argue that the pattern of events over many years suggests that another person may have been involved, and that the failure to identify that person does not necessarily prove that no offender existed. They emphasize that some incidents involved circumstances that appeared difficult to explain without outside involvement, and believe the unanswered questions surrounding those events should not be ignored. Others approach the case from the perspective of evidence evaluation. They point to the fact that, despite extensive investigative efforts, no individual was identified, no suspect was charged, and no physical evidence conclusively connected another person to Cindy's death. From this viewpoint, the lack of confirmation is a central part of understanding the case. The disagreement between these perspectives reflects a broader challenge in criminal investigations. Evidence rarely provides absolute certainty. Instead, investigators must determine which explanations are supported strongly enough by facts. In Cindy's case, the available information created possibilities, but did not establish a final conclusion. The case also demonstrates how public perception can influence the way unresolved investigations are remembered. When a case receives significant attention, people often search for patterns, explanations, and answers. Over time, theories may become widely repeated, even when they have not been proven. This makes it especially important to separate confirmed information from speculation. The confirmed record of Cindy James's case remains clear in several areas. Her reports were investigated, her death was examined through forensic procedures, and the final determination did not establish homicide or suicide conclusively. Beyond those facts, many questions remain open. The case also provides lessons about the relationship between investigation and uncertainty. A successful investigation is not always one that produces an arrest or a complete explanation. Sometimes the role of investigators is to determine what can be proven and to acknowledge when the evidence does not allow further conclusions. This can be one of the most difficult outcomes for everyone involved. For families, uncertainty can feel like an unfinished chapter. Without a confirmed explanation, there may be no clear place to direct grief, anger, or questions. For investigators, unresolved cases represent the challenge of working with incomplete information. For the public, they serve as reminders that reality does not always follow the structure of a simple story. The case of Cindy James remains important because it shows that the search for truth is not always a straight path. It involves examining evidence, questioning assumptions, and accepting the limits of what can be known. More than 30 years later, the mystery surrounding Cindy's death continues to attract attention. New discussions may revisit old evidence, and different interpretations may continue to emerge. However, unless new reliable evidence becomes available, the official conclusion remains unchanged. The death of Cindy James remains classified as an unknown event. That conclusion does not provide the emotional closure that many people seek, but it reflects the reality of the investigation. Many facts were discovered, many questions were examined, but the complete explanation was never proven. The lasting significance of the case is therefore not only the mystery itself. It is the reminder that investigations are built on evidence, and sometimes the evidence leads not to a final answer, but to the recognition that some questions remain unanswered. Cindy James's story continues to be remembered because it represents one of the most challenging situations in criminal investigation. A case where the search for truth continued for years, where countless possibilities were considered, and where the final answer remained beyond reach. The case of Cindy James remains an important example of how complicated criminal investigations can become when evidence does not lead to a single conclusion. Over the years, the case has been examined not only because of the mystery surrounding Cindy's death, but also because of the broader questions it raises about investigation, evidence, and uncertainty. One of the most significant lessons from the case is that investigations are not always a process of finding one missing piece that solves everything. In many situations, investigators must work with incomplete information, conflicting accounts, and evidence that provides only part of the story. The Cindy James investigation demonstrated this reality. From the beginning, investigators faced a difficult situation. The reports made by Cindy over several years created a large investigative record. Police had to examine each report individually, while also considering whether the events were connected. This required careful documentation, interviews, and analysis. The challenge was determining whether the information represented a clear pattern, or whether the events required different explanations. This type of uncertainty is one of the most difficult situations in investigative work. A pattern can be meaningful, but investigators must also ensure that connections are based on evidence rather than assumptions. The case also highlighted the importance of forensic limitations. Modern audiences often view forensic science as a tool that can reveal the complete truth. However, forensic evidence can only answer certain questions. It can identify substances, document injuries, and analyze physical findings, but it cannot always reconstruct every moment of an event or identify responsibility without additional evidence. In Cindy's case, forensic findings provided important information, but they did not resolve every question surrounding her death. This became one of the reasons the case remained open to interpretation. Another important aspect of the investigation was the role of different professional perspectives. Police investigators approached the case through evidence collection and criminal procedures. Medical experts examined physical findings and possible causes. Mental health professionals considered psychological factors. Each perspective contributed to the overall understanding of the case, but none alone could provide a complete explanation. The investigation also demonstrated the importance of avoiding conclusions based only on personal beliefs or public opinion. In highly publicized cases, emotions can influence how people interpret information. Some may focus on evidence that supports a particular theory, while overlooking evidence that creates uncertainty. A careful investigation requires considering all available information, including facts that challenge a preferred explanation. The Cindy James case remains relevant because these challenges continue to exist in modern investigations. Cases involving missing persons, unexplained deaths, or long-term allegations often require authorities to balance multiple responsibilities. They must listen to reports, investigate possible risks, protect individuals, and maintain objective standards of evidence. The case also influenced discussions about unresolved investigations. When a case remains unsolved, there is often pressure to provide an explanation. However, investigators cannot replace evidence with certainty simply because people want answers. The official conclusion of an unknown event reflects this principle. It represents a decision based on the evidence available rather than speculation about what might have happened. For many observers, this conclusion remains unsatisfying. Human beings naturally seek resolution, especially when a person's death involves unanswered questions. However, the purpose of an investigation is not only to provide closure, it is to determine what can be proven. In the years following Cindy's death, the case continued to be analyzed because it represents the difficult reality that some investigations reach a point where the evidence cannot go further. The impact of the case can therefore be understood in two ways. First, it remains a mystery because the circumstances of Cindy's death have never been fully explained. Second, it remains an important example of the challenges investigators face when searching for truth in situations where evidence is incomplete. The case reminds us that criminal investigations are not always defined by dramatic discoveries or final answers. Sometimes they are defined by careful examination, honest uncertainty, and the recognition that some questions may remain unanswered. The story of Cindy James continues to be studied because it reflects one of the most difficult tasks in criminal investigation: understanding events that leave behind evidence, questions, and possibilities, but no final explanation. The case of Cindy James has remained in public memory because it represents something that many investigations struggle with: the possibility that the truth may never be fully reconstructed. Over the years, many cases become clearer with time. New technology can reveal evidence that was previously unavailable. Advances in forensic science can sometimes answer questions that investigators could not solve in the past. Witnesses may come forward with new information. Records may be reviewed from a different perspective. However, the Cindy James case has continued to remain unresolved. The passage of time has not produced a definitive explanation for the events surrounding her death. Instead, it has allowed the case to become a subject of continued discussion, analysis, and debate. One of the reasons the case remains difficult is that it contains multiple layers of uncertainty. There is the question of the incidents Cindy reported during the years before her death. There is the question of whether those events were connected. There is the question of what happened during the final days of her life. And there is the larger question of whether the available evidence is enough to determine a single explanation. Each question leads to another. This complexity is what makes the case unusual. It is not simply an investigation into one event. It is an attempt to understand a long series of events and determine how, or whether, they relate to one another. Investigators often describe complex cases as puzzles. However, the comparison has limits. A puzzle usually has one correct arrangement of pieces. Real investigations are different. Sometimes pieces may be missing. Sometimes pieces may have more than one possible meaning. Sometimes the available pieces do not create a complete picture. The Cindy James case reflects this reality. The investigation established important facts, but those facts did not answer every question. The evidence provided information about what was discovered, what was examined, and what could be confirmed. However, it did not provide enough certainty to establish a complete explanation. This distinction between facts and conclusions is essential. A fact is something supported by evidence. A conclusion requires interpreting those facts and determining what they mean. When evidence allows multiple interpretations, investigators must be careful not to treat one possibility as proven. This principle has remained central to discussions of Cindy's case. Another reason the case continues to be examined is the emotional impact surrounding it. Unresolved deaths often affect not only investigators but also families, friends, and communities. The absence of a final answer can create a lasting sense of uncertainty. For those connected to Cindy, the unanswered questions represented more than an investigative problem. They represented the loss of a person whose life could not be fully separated from the mystery surrounding her death. It is also important to remember that behind every investigation is a human story. Public discussions often focus on theories, evidence, and unanswered questions, but the person at the center of the case had a life beyond the investigation. Cindy James was a nurse and an individual with relationships, experiences, and a personal history. The complexity of the case should not overshadow the fact that it involved a real person's life and death. From a broader perspective, the case demonstrates why criminal investigations require patience and careful evaluation. The desire for answers can be powerful, but conclusions must come from evidence. The official classification of Cindy's death as an unknown event remains a reflection of that approach. It acknowledges that investigators examined the available information, but could not establish a definitive explanation. This outcome may feel incomplete, but it represents the limits of what the evidence allowed. The case continues to serve as a reminder that not every mystery is solved through persistence alone. Sometimes investigators can follow every available lead, examine every piece of evidence, and still reach a point where certainty is impossible. The search for truth does not always end with a final discovery. Sometimes it ends with an honest recognition of uncertainty. And that is why the case of Cindy James continues to be remembered. Not because it produced a simple answer, but because it demonstrates one of the most challenging realities of investigation. Sometimes the facts reveal much, yet the complete story remains unknown. The case of Cindy James remains one of the most unusual and debated investigations in Canadian criminal history. More than 30 years after her death, The case continues to attract attention because it represents a situation where extensive investigation produced many facts, yet failed to produce a single explanation that could be proven. The story of Cindy James is ultimately a story about uncertainty. It is a case where investigators collected information, examined evidence, consulted experts, and followed numerous investigative paths. Despite these efforts, the final circumstances surrounding her death remained unresolved. This does not mean that nothing was discovered. Investigators established a timeline. They documented the events that were reported. They examined the forensic findings. They considered different explanations. They reviewed testimony and professional opinions. But after all of that work, one question remained unanswered. What truly happened? The inability to answer that question is what has kept the case alive in public discussion. Many unresolved cases disappear from attention over time. The Cindy James case remained different because it raised broader questions about how people understand evidence, memory, fear, and investigation. It showed that real investigations are rarely as simple as they appear in stories or documentaries. There is not always a single moment when everything becomes clear. Sometimes the truth is hidden not because investigators failed to search, but because the available evidence does not reveal enough. The case also highlights the importance of approaching complex investigations with both empathy and objectivity. Empathy is necessary because every investigation involves real people. Cindy James was not simply a name in a case file. She was a person with a life, relationships, and experiences before she became associated with an unresolved investigation. Objectivity is equally necessary because conclusions must be based on evidence. Investigators must examine possibilities carefully and avoid declaring certainty where certainty does not exist. This balance remains one of the greatest challenges in criminal investigation. The debate surrounding Cindy's case has continued because different interpretations remain possible. Some people believe the events surrounding her death point toward an unknown offender. Others believe the evidence does not establish that conclusion. The fact that these different views continue to exist demonstrates how complex the case remains. However, regardless of which interpretation someone finds more convincing, the official conclusion has not changed. The available evidence did not allow authorities to determine that Cindy was murdered. It also did not allow them to determine that she died by suicide. The final classification of her death as an unknown event reflected the limits of what could be established. This conclusion represents an important principle in justice and investigation. Uncertainty must sometimes be accepted. A responsible investigation does not create answers where evidence does not exist. It recognizes what is known, identifies what remains unknown, and records the conclusion honestly. The case of Cindy James continues to remind investigators and the public that some mysteries remain because the truth is difficult to recover completely. Time can pass, technology can improve, and new perspectives can emerge, but some questions may remain unanswered. The lasting importance of the case is therefore not only the mystery itself. It is the lesson that searching for truth requires patience, evidence, and humility. Every investigation has limits. Every piece of evidence has boundaries. And sometimes, even after years of searching, the most accurate conclusion is not a definitive answer, but an acknowledgement that the full story cannot be proven. The case of Cindy James remains remembered because it represents that difficult reality. A life was lived. A series of events was investigated. Evidence was examined. Questions were asked. But the final explanation remained beyond reach. And that is why, decades later, the case continues to stand as one of Canada's most complex unresolved investigations. A reminder that some mysteries are not defined by what was discovered, but by what remains unknown. The case of Cindy James has remained a subject of discussion because it represents one of the most difficult situations in criminal investigation. A case where the search for answers was extensive, but the evidence never produced a final conclusion. Over the years, the investigation became more than an attempt to understand one person's death. It became a broader discussion about how investigators handle uncertainty, how evidence is interpreted, and how society responds when the truth cannot be completely established. One of the most important aspects of the case is the difference between having information and having certainty. The investigation contained a significant amount of information. There were reports, interviews, medical examinations, forensic findings, and years of documented interactions with authorities. However, information alone does not always create a complete explanation. Investigators must determine how evidence connects, whether different events share the same cause, and whether a conclusion can be supported strongly enough to withstand examination. In Cindy's case, the evidence created important questions, but did not provide answers that eliminated all other possibilities. This is one of the reasons the case remains controversial. Some observers continue to believe that the events surrounding Cindy's life and death suggest the involvement of another person. They argue that the history of reported incidents and the circumstances of her death should be considered together. Others emphasize the importance of the lack of confirmed evidence linking another individual to the events. They argue that investigations must rely on proof rather than assumptions, regardless of how unusual or concerning the circumstances may appear. The disagreement between these perspectives reflects a larger issue in criminal investigation: the challenge of making decisions when evidence is incomplete. Investigators often work in situations where they do not have perfect information. They must analyze what is available, consider different explanations, and determine what can be established with confidence. Sometimes the result is a clear conclusion. Sometimes it is not. The Cindy James case demonstrates the second possibility. Another important part of the case is the way it changed public understanding of unresolved investigations. Many people expect every mystery to eventually have a final solution. However, real investigations do not always follow that pattern. Some cases remain open because important evidence is missing. Others remain unresolved because the evidence that exists does not point clearly toward one explanation. The Cindy James investigation belongs to this category. The case also shows why careful language matters when discussing unresolved deaths. Words such as possible, suggested, and unconfirmed are important because they distinguish between theories and established facts. This distinction is essential not only for investigators but also for journalists, researchers, and the public. A theory can be interesting and worthy of examination, but it is not the same as proof. The continued attention given to Cindy James's case also reflects a human desire to understand unexplained events. When a person dies under unusual circumstances, people naturally search for meaning and resolution. However, the responsibility of an investigation is not simply to provide an explanation. It is to determine what the evidence can support. The official conclusion of an unknown event remains significant because it represents that careful approach. It acknowledges the findings of the investigation while recognizing that the available evidence did not allow a definitive determination. For many people, this conclusion feels incomplete. But in the context of forensic and legal standards, acknowledging uncertainty can be the most accurate conclusion available. The legacy of Cindy James's case is therefore not only the mystery surrounding her death. It is also the reminder that investigations involve limits, and that truth sometimes requires accepting what cannot be proven. The case continues to be studied because it raises questions that remain relevant today. How should authorities respond when someone reports repeated threats? How can investigators separate patterns from assumptions? How should evidence be evaluated when multiple explanations remain possible? These questions extend beyond one case. They are part of the ongoing challenge of understanding complex human events through careful investigation. The story of Cindy James remains unresolved, but it continues to provide valuable lessons about evidence, uncertainty, and the search for truth. Some investigations end with answers. Others remain as reminders that the pursuit of truth is sometimes a journey without a final destination. The case of Cindy James has remained one of the most complex unresolved investigations in Canada, because it represents a difficult reality of criminal justice. Sometimes the search for truth does not end with a final answer. Over the years, investigators attempted to understand a series of events that unfolded across nearly a decade. The investigation involved police work, forensic analysis, witness interviews, medical examinations, and a formal review of the circumstances surrounding Cindy's death. Despite these efforts, the evidence did not produce a conclusion that could explain every aspect of the case. The official outcome reflected this uncertainty. Cindy James died in 1989, and after examination of the available evidence, the circumstances of her death were classified as an unknown event. This conclusion did not identify a person responsible, nor did it provide a complete explanation of what happened. Instead, it represented the reality that the evidence did not allow investigators to determine a definitive cause beyond uncertainty. For some, this remains one of the most frustrating aspects of the case. Human beings naturally search for complete stories. When something unusual happens, people want to understand the beginning, the events that followed, and the final answer. A mystery without resolution can feel unfinished. However, investigations do not always provide the closure people hope for. The Cindy James case demonstrates that evidence has limits. Investigators can collect information, analyze possibilities, and follow leads, but they cannot create certainty where the evidence does not exist. This principle is especially important in cases involving complicated personal histories and long periods of time. Events may be difficult to reconstruct. Information may be incomplete. Different explanations may remain possible. In Cindy's case, the challenge was not the absence of information. The challenge was understanding what the information meant. The years before her death created a detailed but complicated record. Reports, investigations, and observations became part of a larger picture that continued to be examined. Yet even with all of this information, the investigation could not establish one explanation that excluded all others. This is what makes the case different from many traditional criminal investigations. There was no confirmed suspect. There was no criminal trial. There was no final courtroom decision establishing responsibility. Instead, there was an extensive investigation that ended with uncertainty. The case also remains significant because it raises broader questions about how society understands victims, investigations, and evidence. When someone reports being threatened or harmed, those reports require serious attention. At the same time, investigations must rely on careful evaluation of evidence. Both principles are necessary. The Cindy James case continues to be discussed because it exists in that difficult space between belief and proof. Belief may be influenced by personal experiences, observations, and interpretations. Proof requires evidence strong enough to support a conclusion. The difference between the two is one of the central lessons of criminal investigation. As the years passed, many theories about the case continued to appear. Some focused on the possibility of an unknown offender. Others focused on alternative explanations. Each theory attempted to explain the available information, but none became an established conclusion. The continuing debate shows how powerful unresolved cases can become in public memory. They become more than investigations. They become questions about human behavior, justice, and the limits of knowledge. The legacy of Cindy James's case is not only the mystery surrounding her death. It is also the reminder that behind every investigation is a real person and a real life. Cindy James was remembered by people who knew her, worked with her, and cared about her. The investigation may have focused on unanswered questions, but her life was more than the circumstances that followed her death. Ultimately, the case remains a powerful example of the complexity of seeking truth. Investigators searched for answers. Evidence was examined. Different possibilities were considered. But the final explanation remained uncertain. The story of Cindy James continues because it represents one of the hardest realities in criminal investigation. Sometimes the truth is not hidden because no one looked for it, but because the evidence never revealed the complete story. And after decades of discussion, the case remains what it has always been: an unresolved chapter in Canadian criminal history, defined by facts, questions, and the search for answers that may never fully arrive. The story of Cindy James has continued long after the official investigation ended. While the case remains unresolved, its influence has extended beyond the question of what happened and into broader discussions about criminal investigations, evidence, and the difficulties of understanding complex human situations. Many unresolved cases are remembered because of a single unanswered question. The Cindy James case is different because it contains many questions that remain connected to one another. The investigation was not only about the circumstances of Cindy's death. It was also about understanding the years that came before it, the reports she made, the responses from authorities, and the challenge of determining how those events should be interpreted. This made the case unusually difficult. Investigators were not examining a simple incident with a clear timeline. They were reviewing a long period of events and attempting to determine whether those events formed one continuous pattern or whether they required different explanations. This type of investigation requires careful attention to detail. Every report, every piece of evidence, and every statement must be evaluated individually, while also being considered as part of the larger picture. The difficulty is that patterns can be meaningful, but they can also be misunderstood. Investigators must determine whether similarities between events indicate a connection, or whether they simply appear connected, because they occurred during the same period of time. The Cindy James case remains an example of how challenging that process can become. Another important aspect of the case is the role of uncertainty in justice. People often expect investigations to produce definite answers, but the reality is that some cases do not reach that point. An investigation can be thorough. Evidence can be examined carefully. Experts can provide opinions. And still, the final conclusion may remain uncertain. This does not mean that the investigation had no value. On the contrary, the process of examining evidence and establishing what can and cannot be proven is an essential part of justice. The case also highlights the importance of avoiding assumptions. In highly discussed cases, theories can become powerful. People may develop strong opinions based on certain details that appear important. However, investigators must consider the complete picture rather than focusing only on evidence that supports one explanation. The search for truth requires examining all possibilities, including those that may challenge initial beliefs. Over the years, the Cindy James case has also become part of discussions about how society responds to people who report fear, threats, or danger. It raises difficult questions about how authorities should balance listening to reports, providing protection, and maintaining objective investigations. These questions remain relevant today. The case demonstrates that responding to complex situations requires both compassion and careful analysis. Compassion recognizes the experiences of individuals involved. Analysis ensures that conclusions are supported by evidence. Both are necessary. Another reason the case continues to attract attention is that it reflects a universal human desire for closure. When a person's death remains unexplained, people naturally want to understand why it happened and who, if anyone, was responsible. However, some investigations end not with certainty, but with unanswered questions. The official conclusion of an unknown event represents that reality. It acknowledges that investigators examine the evidence, but could not establish a definitive explanation. For some people, this conclusion feels incomplete. For investigators, it represents the importance of remaining within the boundaries of what evidence can prove. The lasting significance of the Cindy James case is therefore not only the mystery itself. It is the reminder that criminal investigations involve uncertainty, limitations, and difficult decisions. The case shows that truth is not always discovered through one dramatic moment. Sometimes it is found through a long process of examination, review, and acceptance of what can be known. And sometimes, after everything has been investigated, the most accurate answer is simply that the full story remains unknown. The legacy of Cindy James continues because her case represents one of the hardest challenges in criminal investigation. The search for truth when the evidence provides questions, possibilities, and uncertainty, but not a final explanation.